and welcome to this videocast and now podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, a lot's happened this week, and I'll get into that later on. But I want to start with education. Oh, it's boring education. Actually, what's happening to our children and to young people in what's called the education system is so vital for people, not least parents, to appreciate because of the goal that it has, and indeed has to a large extent achieved, of programming and conditioning the minds of young people and children so they become the adults that suit the system in future generations of people in the workplace. What's kind of prompted me to do this subject this week is the announcement by the British government, but it's something you find all around the world, this theme, including the United States. The stated intention of the British government to extend the school day. Just look at it, step by step by step, the totalitarian tiptoe, as I call it, and you'll see how more and more of a child's time is controlled by the state, and how parental power and influence is being eroded at the same speed. We are seeing the minds of children hijacked by the state in multiple ways that I'll be describing. And these plans, which also include a guy from this British education government watchdog called Ofsted, calling for children to go to school at 2. I mean, we're on the road to children coming out of the womb and going straight into the class. Oh, we got one coming out now. Here you go, here you go, here you go, gotcha. Okay, class 1A, algebra. Tell him what x equals. Madness! And we're only where we are now. We are not where this is planned to go. And you can't divorce what's happening in so-called education in terms of control of children by the state, and the way the state's social services around the world are taking on a more and more industrial scale children from loving parents for the most spurious, outrageous reasons, they make them up, and handing them to control of the state. These things are all connected because what we're looking at is the end of parenthood, which is what Aldous Huxley was talking about in Brave New World, published back in the 1930s, but not as the novel it's said to be, but more the blueprint from insider knowledge of where it was meant to go. And that is where we're going now, quicker and quicker. Now, I quote in my new book, Phantom Self, on a kind of range of subjects, a Rockefeller family insider who was speaking in 1969 to a group of doctors, and one of them explain later what he'd said that night. And what he said was how the world was going to change, because it's all planned to change that way. And it is in extraordinary detail the world we see now and the world that's coming so fast, unless we part the arse from the sofa. And what he said a number of things about education. And among them was that children would spend more time in school, but they wouldn't learn anything. And what he meant was they wouldn't learn anything that they needed to know. They would simply, in my words, download their perceptions from the state to suit the state. He talked about education being used to control who had access to information, and that schools would become what he called the hub of the community. And that means, in truth, that schools would become, certainly in the first stage of this sequence, the new parents. And look at how more and more dictatorial powers expressed by dictatorial people, often called head teachers, etc., that are being used by the state to dictate to parents and dictate to children. And more, not even dictate to them only through the school day, but what they do afterwards. I'll get into that later on. And this programming, because what schools are programming prisons. And the idea is to use it as a sausage machine conveyor belt to take children from the earliest age and program their perceptions for life, perceptions that suit the state and the need and desire for mass control. And that means destroying spontaneity, destroying free thought, destroying the ability to look at a situation and see how dots connect. And like I say, it's working. This is a study by the professor of education at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and it involves school-aged children between kindergarten and through to 12th grade. And this is what they found happened in the period in between. A massive decline of creativity as, quote, children became less emotionally expressive, less energetic, less talkative and verbally expressive, less humorous, less imaginative, less unconventional, all the words that the state requires minds to be if it's going to control people en masse. Less lively and passionate, less perceptive, less apt to connect seemingly irrelevant things, connecting dots so you see the picture. Less synthesizing and less likely to see things from a different angle. Precisely. To see things in a barely one-dimensional way, that this is how it is and there's no other possibilities, because that's what the state wants. Schools are programming prisons for children. And when parents say, oh, they care for their kids and they love their kids, and I'm sure they do in that way. But if parents want the best for their children, and they want their children to express their true uniqueness and true potential for creativity, and express the gifts that they have, which may not often involve passing ludicrous exams, then they need to get involved in what's going on. They need to see what's going on. They need to think, what's happening when I drop my child off at school until I pick them up again? What's going on in there? How is my child being educated as against simply programmed with the state's version of everything? So if we look at the definitions of programming and prison. Programming is one, to insert or encode specific operating instructions into a machine or apparatus. They want children to be turned into machines, is the whole point of it. To insert instructions into a machine or apparatus. To cause to absorb or incorporate automatic responses, attitudes, or the like to condition. My goodness me, is that education in one sentence? Or what is claimed to be education? To set, regulate, or modify so as to produce a specific response or reaction. And that's what so-called education is doing. It's conditioning children to set, regulate, or modify so as to produce a specific response or reaction, i.e. see the world the way that suits the state. And then we go on to the definition of prison. Any place of confinement or involuntary restraint. Well, it's confinement because children are told when they have to be there, when they can leave. And it's involuntary restraint because how many kids want to spend virtually their entire formative years in a school being told what to do and what not to do, when to speak and when not to speak, when they can go to the toilet, when they can't? Think about it. This is what's going on. Oh, my children go to a good prison though. And the idea to extend the school day, which is this theme around the world, certainly in Britain very recently, is simply to do the two things. To extend the time each day when this programming can go on. And of course the teachers and ed teachers, the vast overwhelming majority, almost all of them, have no idea, because they've been through the same system and downloaded the same program, they've no idea that they are programmed programmers being used to program the next generation. And of course, one of the things that has been announced with this extension of the school day is that all schools in this country are going to become what they call academies, which is just a fancy way of saying we're moving towards the privatization of education, because the idea is for corporations to run everything, including these prisons of the mind. And not only do we have these long, long school days, we have homework. For many kids, piles of it. So when they leave the prison gives them more work to do to continue the programming of the prison, even when they're not there. Anyone think about this? Homework? You can't, quote, educate people through most of the day, 5 days a week, at least for their entire formative years. They have to have homework as well. It's ridiculous. I think there should be a mass refusal to do homework. Mass refusal. Unless people want to do it, unless the kids say, no, I like homework, I want to do it, fair enough. You want to do what you want. Otherwise, mass refusal to do it. It's nonsense. And it's nothing to do with education, it's to do with control. And in the USA, particularly, I mean Texas, I rest my case, have a look what's going on there. They're imposing the will of the school on more and more of the child's time outside of school. And the idea is not to educate, but simply to prepare the next generation to be the adult slaves of the coming years. And here's a classic. This is a quote from J.D. Rockefeller. Nice man. Very good to his mother, never went home. And he was the creator of the General Education Board in America in 1903. And of course, J.D. Rockefeller, he cared so much about children, he cared so much about people. And this is what he said. I don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers. A nation of obedient slaves. And you hear it all the time, don't you? Governments. Education should prepare children for the workplace. No, it shouldn't. Education should set free all the gifts that children have that don't include passing exams. What are exams? They're just tests to see how much of the programming you've downloaded. Nothing to do with intelligence. I worked with people in journalism years ago who had first-class degrees and all this stuff. Crikey, they could hardly tie their own shoelaces. Remembering facts and intelligence are not the same thing. But we're supposed to believe they are, so we will accept this crap called education. Preparing children for the workplace simply means turning children into unthinking, unquestioning, acquiescent cogs to replace the previous generation of cogs in the state machine. And this is going on more and more. You see, what they're doing, and this extension of the school day is, of course, obviously part of it, is they are reducing and reducing and reducing the time that children and young people have to free think, to ponder, to let their mind wander where it wants to go, to be creative in its true sense. They don't want people like that. Dangerous. And so they are focused in 5 sense reality all day, often filling their minds full of total crap. Algebra. What's all that about? Well, you've got to get educated, get a job. Mr. Brown, you've come for this job today. First question, what does X equal? Anyone ever had that question? I don't know. Well, Mr. Brown, you're not really what we're looking for. It's all rubbish. But it's filling time, and it's filling and blocking potential creativity with this tidal wave of irrelevant crap. Most of it called education. So children don't have mind chill time, me time. And even when they do now, from another angle, we have the addiction to smartphones. So when do most children, young people now have real pondering chill time? When they're not focused on something, school, homework, smartphone. And if anyone thinks that's just a coincidence, they're missing the point completely about what's really going on. And like I say, these schools are becoming dictatorships. The producer on the Richie Allen radio show was sent a letter, as were all the parents to this particular school, regarding something called safeguarding. I talked about that in previous videocasts. Safeguarding children, safeguarding boards, that Orwellian term they use. And safeguarding is Orwellian speak for an excuse for more and more control to protect the children. But you know, just round the corner from here, my children went to the school there. It had a little wall around it, and people walked in and out and took their kids to school, and it was not a problem. There was never any problem. There was never any danger, no threat to them. People just got on with it. It's a school. Go into school, hello, morning, all that stuff. Now you want to see it. It not only is part of this prison system, it looks like a prison. These schools look like prisons. It's got a big prison-like fence around it. You go in one part, but then you can't go in the next part without going through another locked gate, just like they do in prisons. And it's a school for little kids. And this is the letter. And it's this is just one thing it said. We now have one additional safety feature to bring into place. You see the excuse, safety, safety. You look at the thing about terrorism, and then we must take your freedoms away to protect your freedoms from terrorists. It's the same theme in these bloody schools. And it says, if children are not in school for 8:55 a.m., not 8:56, outrageous, minute late. If they're not in school for 8:55 a.m., the parent carer bringing them needs to report to the school office to enter a reason in a late report book. Thank you, it says, for helping us all to keep our children safe and strive to ensure children do not miss the important start to the day. Oh my goodness me. Talk about the programming the next generation. And this letter also says, without parents' knowledge, that some bloke from the Healthy Eating Audit has been looking into their lunch boxes and now has made a report on what's in them. I mean, the control and the influence is all going to the state from parents. Crazy. I mean, you think about this sequence. It's called life in childhood. You come out of the womb, and within this idiot I've just described, once it started 2 years of age, but it's now 3, 4, something like that. You have a few years with your parents, 2, 3 years with your parents, who are also often passing on their programming because they've been through the same sequence you're about to go through. You then find yourself at the age of 3 or 4, just come into the world, and now you're sitting at a desk with an authority figure for all your formative years from now on, telling you what's right and wrong, when you have to be there, 8:55, no later, when you can leave, what you must wear, what's right, what's wrong, when you can eat, like I say, when you go to the toilet. And this is preparing you to become an acquiescent slave throughout your life in terms of acquiescence to authority. And so we're looking at the most blatant programming operation for our kids. And this is why they're doing everything they can, not only to extend the school day, but make sure that children don't have any chance of not being in that program day after day after day after day. That's why they're fining parents now. They're fining parents if their children are not at school, if they're taken away on holiday because it's cheaper outside school time. They're fining parents. It's outrageous. And parents accept it. They might moan about it, but they accept it. Just as there should be a mass refusal to do homework for those that don't want to do it, there should be a mass refusal to pay these fines en masse. Keep children out of school, those who can, until it changes even. En masse, it has to be en masse. I mean, years ago, when my son Jamie was just a little boy, I went on a speaking tour, world speaking tour. And we took him out of school. And we took him to Canada. We took him to Hong Kong. We took him to Australia. We took him to South Africa, where he saw wildlife parks and animals that most people only read about in books, in their, at least up to a point, their natural habitat. And the school was like, oh, he's going to miss out of being away from school for so. No, he's not. And no, he didn't. Oh, you mean he's going to miss out? So you know that book with all those pictures of lions and elephants and what have you? Yeah. So he's missed out by not reading that because he was actually there seeing them in the flesh. I left school at 15, when you could in those days. I'm old. Because I went to be a footballer. And I never took a major exam in my life, let alone pass one. Thank you, God. And now it's a stream of books, which I've been writing for the last 25 years. And not only did I do that despite ignoring education, basically, but ignoring education made it easier because I had a mind that hadn't been programmed with a certain view of everything. Education is a myth. I'm all for education, but that's not what we have. And not only that, children are being prepared not only to accept acquiescence to authority and download a certain perception of life, which they then, repel all borders so often in terms of alternatives to the program and their beliefs and their perceptions. Not only that, but they're being prepared to accept an Orwellian state of technological control on a massive, extreme scale. This is why they're putting more and more cameras in the schools. They're having fingerprints to take library books out, biometrics and all this stuff. Oh, it's to protect the children. Oh, really? Well, why wasn't it necessary before? Just like the massive fences around the school around the corner weren't necessary before. Nothing to do with protecting children. It's to do with preparing them to accept that this is how life is. Get the kids to be brought up with technological control everywhere, cameras everywhere, and they'll be far less likely to rebel against it when everywhere in the world, in their adult life, is the same. And like I said earlier, this is totally connected to the increasing control of children and the stealing of children from loving parents by the state social services. In Scotland now, they are introducing something called a named a guardian, a state guardian. They're actually in the process of designating a state named guardian for every child until aged 18 years. Overriding, because that's the idea, no matter what they tell you, overriding more influence and decision making by parents. And this lady, leader of the Scottish nationalists, Nicola Sturgeon, who, of course, wants independence for Scotland. I think that's great as well, but she wants to keep in the EU, and she wants people to vote to stay in the EU in this referendum, and you can't have an independent anywhere that's in the tyranny that is the EU. So that contradiction in terms is ridiculous also. But she is arguing, and has argued, for these state-designated guardians for children, a named person, they call them. And this is from one of the groups that have been opposing it. This is a state official, the named person, tasked with looking after a child's well-being, which is, of course, extremely subjective. That is their happiness. Well, what does that mean? No, you're not going to be on that smartphone every hour you're awake. Well, that's made me unhappy. I'm going to my guardian. This state guardian will be put in place regardless of whether or not children or parents wish to have one, and regardless of whether there is any need for state intervention. Now think of the Orwellian extremes here that are being sold, as always, with helping and protecting the children, because we care so much. We're controlling their lives. Confusingly, there are already named person pilot schemes in operation across Scotland, but the legislation does not actually go into force until August 2016. A government-funded leaflet said that the duties of the named person include having to check if children get a say in how their room is decorated and what they watch on TV. A named person will have the power to speak to a child, including about very personal issues, and provide information or advice, all without requiring parental consent. And so it goes on. It is absolutely outrageous. And if people can't see what that's about and where it's leading, well, my goodness me, I doubt they can see anything. We're having this situation where our children are being burned out, they're being caused to have a childhood of stress, trying to meet expectations for these prison programming centres, and parents that take their belief in their child's success or failure based on the prison programming centres. And this burning out, where children actually commit suicide because of the pressure and fear of failure of exams, is all planned. I quote you again from the Rockefeller Insider, speaking in 1969. Education. Pressures of the accelerated academic program, the accelerated demands, these pressures will cause some students to burn out. Planned to do that. He said the smartest ones will learn how to cope with pressures and to survive. There will be some help available to students in handling stress, but the unfit won't be able to make it. They will then move on to other things. in this connection, and later on in the connection with drug abuse and alcohol abuse, he indicated that psychiatric services to help would be increased dramatically. We're seeing this, more and more psychiatrists and psychiatric drugs for kids, even at the most ridiculously young ages. In all, the pushing for achievement programming on the states say-so. It was recognized that many people would need help, and the people worth keeping around would be able to accept and benefit from that help and still be super achievers. Those who could not would fall by the wayside and therefore were sort of dispensable, expendable, I guess is the word I want. This is what is happening to children every day. Their parents say, see you later, pick you up after school. And it's so incessant and it's so all-pervading that the teachers who are directly playing the part of child programmers think they're doing the best for the kids. If we don't address this and parents don't get together and address this en masse, then what's the next generation of adults going to be like in terms of free thought, questioning the state's impositions? This is a massive, massively important topic and subject which needs to be addressed before it's too late. And I've got a list here of 18 signs that life in US schools is now essentially equivalent to life in US prisons. Exactly what I've been saying. It says, in the United States today, our public schools are not very good at educating our students, but they sure are great training grounds for learning how to live in a big brother police state control grid. Exactly. Sadly, life in many US public schools is now essentially equivalent to life in US prisons. Most parents don't realize this, but our students have very few rights when they are in school. Our public school students are being watched, tracked, recorded, searched, and controlled like never before. Back when I was in high school, the writer says, it was unheard of for a police officer to come to school. But today, our public school students are being handcuffed and arrested in staggering numbers, preparing them to accept all that stuff when they're adults. When I was young, he says, we would joke that going to school was like going to prison, but today that is actually true. The following are 18 signs that life in our public schools is now very similar to life in our prisons. And of course, we in Britain call public schools, but that's the name we give to private schools, fee-paying schools. But of course, in America, public schools means state schools. One, I won't go through them all, just pick out some as I go through. One, Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli has announced that school officials can search the cell phones and laptops of public school students if there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that the search will turn up evidence that the student has violated or is violating either the law or the rules of the school. No, nothing less than just stop and search in the adult world. Another one, it came out in court that one school district in Pennsylvania secretly recorded more than 66,000 images of students using webcams that were embedded in school-issued laptops that the students were using at home. Another one, if you can believe it, he says, a certified TSA official, TSA, they're the people, for people that maybe have not been to America, that do all the security at airports and such places. A certified TSA official was recently brought in to oversee student searches at the Santa Fe High School prom. At one public school in the Chicago area, children have been banned from bringing their lunches from home. Yes, you read that correctly, the writer says. Students at that particular school are absolutely prohibited from bringing lunches from home. Instead, it is mandatory that they eat the food, brackets, crap, that the school cafeteria serves. The US Department of Agriculture is spending huge amounts of money to install surveillance cameras in cafeterias of schools so that government control freaks can closely monitor what our children are eating. Well, I can tell them, crap. And the Department of Agriculture, they're same people, along with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that have no problem with pesticides and herbicides from corporations like Monsanto going in the food. But no, we've got to put cameras in to cafeterias at school to see what the kids are eating. But it's not about that, is it? If they cared about what kids are eating, they wouldn't let pesticides and herbicides go into the food. They wouldn't have genetically modified food. It's about control and surveillance and getting kids used to it, being everywhere when they get older. A teenager in suburban Dallas was recently forced to take on a part-time job after being ticketed for using bad language in one high school classroom. The original ticket was for $340, but additional fees have raised the total bill to $637. And parents, what will the reaction of a lot of people be to that? Oh, well, he shouldn't have used bad language then. It's not just high school kids that are being ticketed by the police. The article says, in Texas, Texas control children schools or whatever, Orwellian schools, any group of words with Texas in them, and see what's happening there. Because what's happening in Texas now is planned for everywhere. In Texas, the crackdown extends all the way down to elementary school students. In fact, it has been reported that Texas police gave 1,000 tickets to elementary school kids over a recent 6-year period. A few months ago, a 17-year-old honor student in North Carolina named Ashley Smithwick accidentally took her father's lunch with her to school. It contained a small paring knife which he would use to slice up apples. So what happened to this standout student when the school discovered this? The school suspended her for the rest of the year and the police charged her with a misdemeanor. Why aren't the people that run the school being charged with idiocy? Can you imagine the level of programming it takes to suspend a child and bring the police for the rest of the year and bring the police in for mistaking one lunchbox for another? I mean, it's a form of mental illness. Well, it's not a form of mental illness, it is mental illness. These people are teaching children. A little over a year ago, a 6-year-old girl in Florida was handcuffed. 6-year-old girl was handcuffed and sent to a mental facility after throwing temper tantrums at her elementary school. A 12-year-old in New York, a 12-year-old girl, was arrested by police and marched out of her school in handcuffs just because she doodled on her desk. "I love my friends Abby and Faith" was what she reportedly wrote on the desk before being taken away in handcuffs. Can you imagine what it must be like for children in that atmosphere to get up in the morning and think that they've got to go back to school again, like every day, to be brought up in that atmosphere, surrounded by adult morons in uniform and classrooms. It must be a nightmare. What are we allowing to be done to them? Oh, I love my child. I take him to school every day and drop him off. Breathe, Dave, breathe, 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 breathe. There are some schools in the United States that are so paranoid that they have installed cameras in student bathrooms, the toilets as we would call them in Britain. They're doing it here too. In Florida, students have been arrested by police for bringing in a plastic butter knife to school, for throwing an eraser, and for drawing a picture of a gun. Did it go off? The Florida State Department of Juvenile Justice has announced that it will begin using analysis software to predict crime by young delinquents, in their eyes, and will place potential offenders in specific prevention and education programs. Look, most people now, if not everybody, watching this video cast, this long part of the video cast that isn't seen on the main internet, will of course realize what this is all about. But other people don't see it. They don't see how schools are mirroring, indeed leading, the control system in the wider world, because that's what they're getting children used to, in fear of authority, where control technology is just part of life. You see, what we shouldn't forget is when you come into this world, at the point you do in this process of unfolding reality, you kind of take it as how things are. They are your normal. So people like me of my age can see what it was like in the 50s. And schools were still prisons then, but nothing like on the scale they are now. And how the world has changed, not just in schools, but in the world in general, in terms of control, surveillance. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the changes that have taken place and continue to take place. But young people now, coming into the world, that's their normal. What we find outrageous, because we've seen the process of change, that's their normal. And that's why it's so encouraging that so many young people, nothing like the majority of course, but so many young people, despite all this programming, despite all that they are facing, I feel for them. I feel for them so much, because they are the most targeted generation in known human history. What's encouraging is that they're seeing through it and still rebelling against it. Like I say, nothing like the majority, but the numbers that are beginning to see it are encouraging. A group of high school students made national headlines a while back when they revealed that they were ordered by a security guard to stop singing the national anthem during a visit to the Lincoln Memorial. And of course all this, again, at a young age, get them early, get them for life, that's the idea. They don't want countries. They want regions controlled by superstates like the European Union. They want the end of countries. So this other theme of suppressing national pride, national anthems, whatever, is all part of that process of conditioning people to accept the end of countries. In some US schools, armed police, accompanied by police dogs, conduct surprise raids with their guns drawn. In a video, you can see police officers aiming their guns at school children as the students are lined up facing the wall. This is all about traumatization and, again, fear of authority. One 8-year-old boy in Massachusetts was sent home from school and was forced to undergo a psychological evaluation. That's coming in more and more. This is why the Obama administration has said it wants to have mental health assessments for everyone, not these children. And he was forced to undergo a psychological evaluation because he drew a picture of Jesus on the cross. 13 parents in Duncan, South Carolina were ticketed for cheering during a high school graduation. See, that's another theme of this, that parents are being treated in the same way. Parents are being told what to do and what not to do and when to be here and when not to be there by schools in the same way the kids are. And they take it. Few of them might moan about it, but they take it. We need to get bloody organised. And have this en masse non-cooperation with this, for our children's sake, above all. Another excellent article. This was from a few years back, but exactly spot on what's happening now. School is a prison and damaging our kids. Longer school years aren't the answer. You see, this longer school years thing is the theme, because that's the idea. The problem is school itself. Compulsory teach and test simply doesn't work, but it's not meant to work in terms of educating the kids. It's meant to work in terms of programming the kids. That's the point. The article goes, parents send their children to school with the best of intentions, believing that that's what they need to become productive and happy adults. Last thing they need to do for either. Many have qualms about how well schools are performing, but the conventional wisdom is that these issues can be resolved with more money, better teachers, more challenging curricula, and or more rigorous tests. But what is the real problem? It's school itself. The unfortunate fact is that one of our most cherished institutions is, by its very nature, failing our children and our society, as it's meant to. School is a place where children are compelled to be and where their freedom is greatly restricted, far more restricted than most adults would tolerate in their workplaces. In recent decades, we have been compelling our children to spend ever more time in this kind of setting, and there is strong evidence that this is causing serious psychological damage to many of them, as planned. Moreover, more scientists have learned about the more they've learned about how children naturally learn, the more we've come to realize that children learn most deeply and fully and with the greatest enthusiasm in conditions that are almost opposite to those of school. That's why schools are the opposite to the best way to truly learn. Compulsory schooling has been a fixture of our culture now for several generations. It's hard today for most people to even imagine how children would learn what they must for success in our culture without it. President Obama and his Secretary of Education are so enamored with schooling that they want an even longer school day and school years, same as here in Britain. Most people assume that the basic design of schools as we know them today emerge from scientific evidence about how children learn best, but in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Usual story. Schools as we know them today are a product of history, not of research into how children learn. The blueprint still used for today's schools was developed during the Protestant Reformation, when schools were created to teach children to read the Bible, to believe Scripture without questioning it, and to obey authority figures without questioning them. See, in those days, religion was the foundation of control and perception suppression, and so they created these schools to make that happen. and the school system and the way of doing things to make that happen. And all that's gone on since is that the same blueprint is being used in the wider context in what we call schools today, but it's just the same, with the same ambition. The early founders of schools were quite clear about this in their writings. The idea that schools might be places for nurturing critical thought, creativity, self-initiative, or ability to learn on one's own, the kind of skills most needed for success in today's economy, was the furthest thing from their minds. To them, willfulness was sinfulness, to be drilled or beaten out of children, not encouraged. Now it's done with handcuffs and other punishments for not conforming. And when schools were taken over by the state and made compulsory and directed towards secular ends, the basic structure and methods of schooling remained unchanged. Subsequent attempts at reform have failed because though they've tinkered with some of this structure, they haven't altered the basic blueprint because it's working from their point of view. The top-down teach and test method, in which learning is motivated by a system of rewards and punishments rather than by curiosity or by any real felt desire to know, is well designed for indoctrination and obedience training, but not much else. It's no wonder that many of the world's greatest entrepreneurs and innovators either left school early, like Thomas Edison, or said they hated school and learned despite it, not because of it, like Albert Einstein. Although Edison learned without any help from school how to steal other people's ideas, like from Nikola Tesla. It's no wonder that today even the, quote, best students, maybe especially them, the writer says, often report that they are burned out by the schooling process. See that quote from that Rockefeller Insider from earlier. One recent top graduate, explaining to a newspaper reporter why he was postponing college, put it this way: I was consumed with doing well and didn't sleep a lot the last 2 years. I would have had 5 or 6 hours of homework each night. The last thing I wanted was more school. Most students, whether A students, C students, or failing ones, and who decides that? The state, by its own criteria for failure and success. They've lost their zest for learning by the time they reach middle school or high school. A recent research study fitted more than 800 6th through 12th graders from 33 different schools across the country with wristwatches that provided a signal at random times of the day. Whenever the signal appeared, they were to fill out a questionnaire indicating where they were, what they were doing, and how happy or unhappy they were at the moment. The lowest levels of happiness by far occurred when they were in school, and the highest levels occurred when they were out of school playing or talking with friends. In school, they were often bored, anxious, or both. Other researchers have shown that with each successive grade, students develop increasingly negative attitudes towards the subjects taught, especially maths and science. So these named person guardians in Scotland, who are there to look after the happiness of the children, when the children say, going to school makes me unhappy, will the state say, oh, okay, don't go then? No, of course not. Because there's nothing to do with the child's happiness. It's to do with the child's control and control of their mind. The article goes on, as a society, we tend to shrug off such findings. We're not surprised that learning is unpleasant. We think of it as a bad-tasting medicine, tough to swallow, but good for children in the long run. Some people, idiots, even think that the very unpleasantness of school is good for children, so they'll learn to tolerate unpleasantness. Because life after school is unpleasant. Well, it's just, life after school is just a continuation of school, when you look at it. Perhaps this sad view of life derives from schooling. Of course it does. Of course, life has its ups and downs in adulthood and in childhood, but there are plenty of opportunities to learn to tolerate unpleasantness without adding unpleasant schooling to the mix. Research has shown that people of all ages learn best when they are self-motivated, pursuing questions that are their own real questions and goals that they are own real life goals. In such conditions, learning is usually joyful. I mentioned earlier, I left school at 15, never passed, never mind, took a major exam. And I did all my learning on my terms, based on what I wanted to learn and how I wanted to learn it. And yes, it was a pleasant thing to do, rather than sitting in school being told what I must remember, because the state demands it. So I have spent, the writer says, much of my research career studying how children learn. Children come into the world beautifully designed to direct their own education. Of course, they do. But does the state want that? Are you kidding? They are endowed by nature with powerful educative instincts, including curiosity, playfulness, sociability, attentiveness to the activities around them, desire to grow up and desire to do what older children and adults do. The evidence for all this, the writer says, as it applies to little children, lies before our eyes, for anyone who has watched a child grow from birth to school age. Through their own efforts, children learn to walk, run, jump, and climb. They learn from scratch their native language, and with that, they learn to assert their will, argue, amuse, annoy, befriend, charm, and ask questions. Through questioning and exploring, they acquire an enormous amount of knowledge about the physical and social world around them. And in their play, they practice skills that promote their physical, intellectual, social, and emotional development. They do all of this before anyone in any systematic way tries to teach them anything. And one of the that's a key line there, where it talks about their ability to learn from their own basic creativity, from their own questioning, from their own exploring, because the education system is about activating. This is why they want children in school at the earliest possible age. It's about activating those parts of the brain, widely collectively known as the left brain, which see the world basically as the state wants them to see it, as the global cabal in the end wants them to see it. It's about structure, about hierarchy, about seeing dots but not connecting dots. So everything is apart from everything else. This is how that part of the brain works. What they don't want is the right brain being triggered, which is about creativity, it's about spontaneity, it's about uniqueness of view, uniqueness of perception, and it's about connecting dots in a way that the other part of the brain cannot. So what they're doing by putting people in children in an academic left brain setting from the start of their lives virtually, is to build up that part of the brain as the dominant perceiver of reality, boom, boom, and suppress the right side of the brain. This is why things like art and music and creativity and free thinking and just daydreaming, letting your mind wander where it wants to go. That's why they're all suppressed in school. That's why things like music and art are so underfunded. And even then, much of the time, taught in a left brain way. It's all systematic. People need to get an understanding of how detailed and systematic this is. I mean, if anyone, those that read Phantom Self and see what this Rockefeller insider was saying in 1969 compared with what's happening in the world today, no one would surely contend that this is not all long planned in detail. And the same access to the projected agenda that the Rockefeller insider got, so did Aldous Huxley get in the 30s, so did Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell, when he produced his book 1984. This amazing drive and capacity, the writer says, for natural learning does not turn itself off when children become 5 or 6. We turn it off with our coercive system of schooling. The biggest, most enduring lesson of our system of schooling is that learning to work is to be avoided when possible. The focus of our own research has been on learning in children who are of school age but aren't sent to school. Now, this bit is really interesting in terms of the alternative to what's going on. But who aren't sent to school or not to school as conventionally understood. I've examined how children learn in cultures that don't have schools, especially hunter-gatherer cultures, the kinds of cultures in which our species evolved. I've studied learning in our culture by children who are trusted to take charge of their own education and are provided with the opportunity and means to educate themselves. In these settings, children's natural curiosity and zest for learning persist all the way through childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. Because if learning is coming from you and you are enjoying it because you're in control of it, then of course you're going to want to continue to learn for the rest of your life, not switch it off because it's so horrible as in the school system. Another researcher who has documented the power of self-directed learning, which is what this is about, it's a very good term, is Sugata Mitra. He set up outdoors computers in very poor neighborhoods in India, where most children did not go to school and many were illiterate. Whenever he placed such a computer, dozens of children would gather around and with no help from an adult, figure out how to use it. And if you figure out how to use it yourself, you know how to use it far more than if someone's kind of taught you. Goes in much deeper. Those who could not read began to do so through interacting with the computer and with other children around it. The computers gave the children access to the whole world's knowledge in one remote village. Children who previously knew nothing about microorganisms learned about bacteria and viruses through their interactions with the computer and began to use this new knowledge appropriately in conversations. Mitra's experiments illustrate how 3 core aspects of human nature, curiosity, playfulness, and sociability, can combine beautifully to serve the purpose of education. Curiosity drew the children to the computer, motivated them to explore it. Playfulness motivated them to practice many computer skills, and sociability allowed each child's learning to spread like wildfire to dozens of other children. But all this is what the state and the global cabal do not want, and that's why it only happens as rarely with aware people who get off their backsides and do something about it. In our culture today, there are many routes through which children can apply their natural drives and instincts to learn everything they need to know for a successful adulthood. More than 2 million children in the United States now base their education at home and in the larger community rather than at school, and an ever-increasing proportion of their families have scrapped set curricular approaches in favour of self-directed learning. See, people are beginning to wake up to it. It's just a matter of scale. These parents do not give lessons or tests, but provide a home environment that facilitates learning, and they help connect their children to community activities from which they learn. Some of these families began this approach long ago and have adult children who are now thriving in higher education and careers. I know people myself like that. My colleague Gina Riley and I recently surveyed 232 such families. According to these families' reports, the main benefits of this approach lie in the children's continued curiosity, creativity, and zest for learning, and in the freedom and harmony the entire family experiences when relieved of the pressures and schedules of school and the burden of manipulating children into doing homework that doesn't interest them. As one parent put it, our lives are essentially stress-free. So are their children. Yeah? I mean, you know, when you compare what's being described here with the burnouts and the even suicides because of the stress of school and exams, I mean, you can see how the world could be. Our lives are essentially stress-free. We have a close relationship built on love, mutual trust, and mutual respect. And she went on to write that, as an educator, I see my daughter has amazing critical thinking skills that many of my adult college students lack. My daughter lives and learns in the real world and loves it. What more could I ask for? You see that? I mean, it is so blatantly obvious and in your face. Through this method of self-directed learning, my daughter has amazing critical thinking skills, which is exactly what the state doesn't want people to have. Riley and I are currently completing a study of approximately 80 adults who themselves were homeschooled in this self-directed way when they were of school age. The full results are not yet in, but it is clear that those who took this approach came from a variety of socio-economic backgrounds and have, as a whole, gone on very successfully into adulthood. As a self-directed approach to home education has increased in popularity, more and more centres and networks have popped up to offer resources, social connections, and additional educational opportunities for children and families taking this approach. With these, along with libraries and other community resources that have been always been available, and of course the internet, the educational opportunities are now boundless if people choose or have the opportunity to do that. And for me, the best thing is to get groups of people together and groups of parents together who want to take that approach and do that as a group, because of course not everyone can homeschool their children, because the system means that so many need to be out earning money during the day to keep the roof over their head. But there's always ways round things if the motivation is there. Headline: Why don't students like school? I can't think. Someone recently referred me, the writer says, to a book that they thought I'd like. It's a 2009 book aimed towards teachers of grades K through 12, titled Why Don't Students Like School? It's by a cognitive scientist named Daniel T. Willingham, and it has received rave reviews by countless people involved in the school system. Well, it can't be up to much then. Google the title and author and you'll find pages and pages of doting reviews and nobody pointing out that the book totally and utterly fails to answer the question posed by its title. Willingham's thesis is that students don't like school because their teachers don't have a full understanding of certain cognitive principles and therefore don't teach as well as they could. They don't present material in ways that appeal best to students' minds. Presumably, if teachers followed Willingham's advice and used the latest information cognitive science has to offer about how the mind works, students would love school. Talk about avoiding the elephant in the room, the writer quite rightly says. Ask any school child why they don't like school and they'll tell you school is prison. They may not use those words because they're too polite, or maybe they've just been brainwashed to believe that school is for their own good and therefore can't be prison. But decipher their words, and the translation is generally school is prison. Let me say that, the writer says a few more times. School is prison, school is prison, school is prison, school is prison, school is prison. Willingham surely knows that school is prison. He can't help but know it. Everybody knows it. But here he writes a whole book entitled Why Don't Students Like School? And not once does he suggest that possibly they don't like school because they like freedom, and in school they're not free. I shouldn't be too harsh, he says, on Willingham. He's not the only one avoiding this particular elephant in the room. Everyone who has ever been to school knows that school is prison, but almost nobody says it. It's not polite to say it. We all tiptoe around this truth. You'll notice I do it all the time. That school is prison, because telling the truth makes us all seem so mean. How could all these nice people be sending their children to prison for a good share of the first 18 years of their lives? How could our democratic government, which is founded on principles of freedom and self-determination, love it, make laws requiring children and adolescents to spend a good portion of their days in prison? It's unthinkable, and so we try hard to avoid thinking it. Or if we think it, we at least don't say it. When we talk about what's wrong with schools, we pretend not to see the elephant, and we talk instead about some of the dander that's garnered around the elephant's periphery. But I think it's time to say it out loud. School is prison. If you think school is not prison, please explain the difference. The only difference I can think of, the writer says, is to get into prison you have to commit a crime, but they put you in school just because of your age. In other respects, school and prison are the same. In both places, you are stripped of your freedom and dignity. You are told exactly what you must do. You are punished for failing to comply. And actually, in school, you must spend more time doing exactly what you're told to do than is true in adult prison. So in that sense, school is worse than prison. At some level of their consciousness, everybody who has ever been to school knows that it's a prison. How could they not know? But people rationalize it by saying, not usually in these words, that children need this particular kind of prison and may even like it if prison is run well. If children don't like school, according to this rationalization, it's not because school is prison, but because the wardens are not kind enough or amusing enough or smart enough to keep the children's mind occupied appropriately. And here's another story, School Surveillance, How Big Brother Spies Upon Pupils, and it is an extraordinarily detailed explanation of the scale and extremes to which surveillance of children has now gone. And before I move on to other things, just finally, this is from a British newspaper, not related to anything that I've said by the newspaper on the subjects I've talked about so far, but just a one-off about this particular situation. But this is completely connected to all that. Excuse me. Stressed children as young as 2 are sent to hypnotists. Soaring numbers of parents are sending their children to be hypnotized to cure stress. What are we doing? What are we allowing to be done? Anxiety over school tests is blamed for fueling the rise, although children as young as 2 are being treated for issues as diverse as tantrums, bedwetting, and fussy eating. Fussy eating? It's called childhood! Experts last night warned parents of the potential risks they are running by using the therapists. No, take them to school instead, that'll sort them. Pointing out that anyone could become a hypnotist with little or no training. Well, what about all these people in schools called teachers? They're trained to program, but they're not trained to teach. Adverts for children's hypnotherapy have started to appear in the biggest parenting website, And the National Council for Hypnotherapy said its 1,600 members had reported a rise in the number of youngsters being treated over the past 3 years. We are destroying our children's childhood. We are destroying our children's minds. We are destroying our children's joy and perceptions by allowing the state to target them mercilessly. But the state, of course, cares about them. Just this before I move on. MIT scientists fed radioactive oatmeal to schoolboys to see what would happen. Between 1946 and 1953, anyone kid themselves that this sort of thing is not still going on and worse. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, conducted a horrifying experiment in which schoolboys were fed radioactive oatmeal simply to support marketing claims made by the Quaker Oats Company. The study was performed on more than 100 boys, many of whom were wards of state and had been falsely declared mentally retarded, according to the New York Times. The boys were recruited to join the Fernald Science Club. They and their parents, for boys who had parental guardians, were told that they were taking part in simply a study in connection with the MIT Nutrition Department aimed at helping to improve the nutrition of children. In order to make the study sound appealing, the boys and their guardians were told that they would be given a quart of milk daily, taken to a baseball game, to the beach, and to some outside dinners, and they would enjoy it greatly. No mention was made of the fact that they were eating Quaker oats provided along with a research grant by that company laced with radioactive iron and calcium. You had to drink the milk, that was the thing, remembered one participant years later. Shockingly, the entire point of the study was simply that Quaker Oats wanted to make advertising claims, similar to those made by a competitor, Cream of Wheat, that the nutrients in their cereal traveled throughout the body. So that's the kind of level of care for children that the state and its agencies really have. And we are being pressured to give control of our children more and more to that mentality. Well, of course, this week we've had another terrorist attack in Europe, this time in Belgium. What I don't like to do is to, jump all over these things immediately. I like to let the information come out and then put together a kind of response to the official story on the basis of that information. But even at this stage, it's another classic where you have a problem created by whatever covert means, and these people often involved, the bombers themselves, are completely clueless for reasons I've explained before of their true masters, where actually it's all been orchestrated from. And this is a report. It says lethal failures of the bungling Belgians. More jihadis have travelled from Belgium to fight for IS in Syria and Iraq than any other country in Europe. Yet through Brussels, although Brussels is clearly a hotbed of young radical Islamists, the Belgian authorities still fail to prevent the atrocities. Now, this is a common theme of these terrorist attacks of this kind, is that there's always a security breakdown, because they're attacking Belgium for this now. One of the things I would suggest to remember when these attacks happen is it's not just about those who carry them out. It's about those who allowed them to happen, because the normal security was not active or even not there. An example, just before they assassinated Martin Luther King, the usual security was withdrawn. And you see this more and more and more whenever you see these assassinations, you see these terrorist attacks, the normal security was withdrawn. I mean, that was the case all over 9/11. So this bungling Belgian story, how could they let it happen, is, like I say, a classic of its kind in terms of the way these things work. And this is another interesting aspect to the Belgian attacks. There is another common theme in these security situations involving either terrorist attacks or people blamed for terrorist attacks going through an airport onto a plane. And that is the company that controls, invariably at these airports, the security. This is a story headed "Former Israeli Intel Operatives Run Security at Brussels Airport." The Aviation and General Security Services firm ICTS handles security operations at Brussels Airport, the scene of a bomb attack yesterday morning. ICTS was established in 1982 by 4 members of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, obviously fundamentally connected to Mossad, the external one, and El Al airline security agents, and has a major presence around the world in airport security, including operations in the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Japan, and Russia. And by the way, El Al security, the airline, the Israeli airline security agents, equals Mossad. I mean, all these various aspects of Israeli security are all in the end connected to Shin Bet and or to Mossad and all. ICTS uses the security system employed in Israel, whereby passengers are profiled to assess the degree to which they pose a potential threat on the basis of a number of indicators, including age, name, origin, behavior, during questioning. I've been through, they wouldn't let me in now, I'm sure, but I've been through Tel Aviv Airport and come out through Tel Aviv Airport. And the level of security is unbelievable. First of all, before you get to the check-in desk, you're being questioned by some bloke in uniform. And then they go away, and another one comes up. In my case, it was a woman the second time. And then they ask you the same questions, trying to catch you out, giving different answers to the first time. You haven't got to the check-in desk yet. But security, despite being so fierce like that in Israel, tends to break down when terrorists are going through airports, which this company are controlling the security. Chairman of the Supervisory Board of ICTS is Menachem J. Azmon. Azmon is a former Likud party member who was indicted and convicted in 1996 in a fraud and embezzlement case relating to the misappropriation of funds raised by charities. Azmon is also CEO of the Port Authority of Rostock in Germany. This will not, however, be the first time that ICTS has come under scrutiny for possible security lapses during a, quote, Muslim terror attack. This story, former Israeli intel operatives run security at Brussels Airport, only tells part of the story, because in terms of terrorism, it's not only Brussels Airport. As the provider of security services to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport and United Airlines and US Airways, the firm's security system was criticized for somehow allowing erstwhile underwear bomber, the underwear bomber, to slip through and board Northwest Airlines Flight 253 to Detroit with explosive materials on Christmas Day 2009. The Christmas knicker bomber, as the article calls him, was not your usual disgruntled Arab or lowly Muslim acolyte. He was the son of a Nigerian banking mogul and former Nigerian government minister, one of the richest men in Africa. We're talking about one of the African colonial elite here, an African version of the British Old Boy network. While in London, his son, the knicker bomber, lived in a £4 million apartment in Mansfield Street in the city's West End. He also enjoyed access to visas for several countries, including the US. Unlike most alleged Muslim terrorists who usually bring their passports to the scene of their suicide attacks and leave them there for police to find, this Nicke bomber apparently arrived at Schiphol Airport to board his flight to the US with a one-way ticket, no luggage, and without a passport through this ICTS security system. Now, usually this would have spelled premature end to his planned attack, but according to Detroit attorney and eyewitness to events at Schiphol, a man called Kurt Haskell, the Nicke bomber benefited from the help of a sharply dressed Indian man who was able to escort the youngster to the boarding gate, where he told the attendant that the bomber, as he became, had no passport but should be allowed on the flight anyway. When the sharply dressed man was told that he would have to speak to the security manager, ICTS presumably, talk to the security manager, he did so and successfully planted the Nicke bomber on the plane. Now, this requires some serious string pulling, and all the hoopla in the press at the time about whether or not the security system worked was just hubris, because if the Nicke bomber appeared at the gate without a passport, it is unlikely that he went through the normal process up to that point, including check-in, which requires passengers to show their passports. In all probability, he was escorted as a VIP to the gate by the sharply dressed man. So how did two suspicious-looking dudes, at least one of them without a passport, carrying bomb materials, get to the gate in an airport and then onto the flight? The answer is they don't, unless they have some friends among the people running the security controls at the airport, in this case, ICTS. Within a few months, the underwear bombers attack, the U.S. State Department admitted that it had known about his intentions for some time and had not revoked his entry visa to the USA because they effectively wanted to see what he would do. Got to go to school and then get educated. Revocation action would have disclosed what they were doing. Kennedy said in testimony before the House Committee on Homeland Security, allowing the bomber to keep the visa increased chances of federal investigators having a closer look or apprehending the terror network he is accused of working with, rather than simply knocking out one soldier in that effort, they said, desperate for an excuse. But ICTS's security faux pas don't end there. In December 2001, they somehow managed to let deranged shoe bomber Richard Reed onto his Miami-bound flight in Paris, and this was after ICTS had cleared Reed through security at Amsterdam Airport on a flight to Tel Aviv in July 2001 for what was apparently an all-expenses-paid week-long trip to the Israeli city. What precisely he did there remains a mystery. Reed later said that ICTS El Al had failed to detect that he had explosives in his shoes on the flight to Tel Aviv, an amazing revelation considering the Israeli airline's tight security, like I say, been there, and the fact that 6 months later they were responsible for letting him board the Miami-bound flight with the very same type of shoe bomb. Israel had not informed the British, American, or any other security agency of their concerns about Reed. Reed's aunt, Claudette Lewis, who raised Reed in South London, was quoted as saying she believed her nephew had been brainwashed. ICTS also somehow missed several of the alleged 9/11 hijackers who allegedly flew out of Boston's Logan Airport on September the 11th, 2001. ICTS also handled security for London's bus network during the July 7, 2005 suicide bomb attacks. In fact, two of its subsidiaries, ICTS UK and ICTS Europe Systems, are based at Tavistock House, Tavistock Square in London, scene of the London bus bombing that day. That's quite a record, all in all. Yeah, just a coincidence. And we have to wonder how many terror attacks could have been prevented, how many innocent lives saved, how much further we might be today from burgeoning police state if outfits like ICTS and those that support them had not allowed so many unlikely and hapless, quote, Muslim terrorists to, quote, slip through. Of all the authoritarian leaders that benefit from the insecurity created by Muslim terrorism, the political elite of the State of Israel benefit the most. And of all the people who suffer from terrorist attacks, people of Muslim faith suffer the most. Israel, a country created on stolen Palestinian land and surrounded by Muslims, requires the continued threat of Muslim terrorism to justify its existence. Now, another story this week was that the British police have closed down an investigation known as Operation Midland to seek to uncover evidence of an elite Westminster paedophile ring. And of course, those of us that have been uncovering this and exposing this ring and others connected in America and other parts of the world, in my case since the mid-1990s, have been waiting for this announcement. I don't know about the witnesses they have been questioning in relation to this, because they weren't any contact source that I ever worked with in terms of uncovering the ring, etc., and the people involved. This one is known by the pseudonym of Nick, that seems to have been the basis of Operation Midland. He's now called a fantasist whose wild claims prompted Scotland Yard's bungled VIP paedophile murder inquiry, may himself be investigated for wasting police time. A genuine abuse victim has accused the man, known by his pseudonym Nick, of deliberately making up the allegations. The victim lodged a formal complaint to the Metropolitan Police alleging Nick stole part of his story of abuse from him and other people and called for him to face criminal proceedings. His bombshell complaint was lodged hours after the Met finally admitted that it had found no evidence to support astonishing claims that a string of establishment figures was responsible for killing 3 boys in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, the thing is that I don't know this Nick. I've never spoken to him, and I don't know who he is. But, and he may, from his point of view, have believed he was telling the truth, and I'm not casting aspersions on that. All I am saying is one of the ways that they trash the truth about elite paedophile rings is by people, for whatever reason, claiming abuse that never happened. Not saying that's the case with this Nick, I'm just saying that that's one of the techniques they use. And so what that does, because all the media, as in this case, focus upon this one thing, that if they can trash that one, then all the abuse victims who are telling the truth about their abuse by this ring and its famous members are, by definition, tainted by the focus on that one. And this is what's clearly been happening over the months, because there was a point in the wake of the Jimmy Savile revelations when these paedophile rings started to, which I've been investigating and uncovering since the 1990s, started to enter the public domain. And the paedophile elite were desperate to put the lid on it. And now, in this investigation anyway, the lid has been put on it. And yet, we are being asked to believe that, see, this is how it works. you had the revelations of this so-called BBC entertainer called Jimmy Savile, who was a close friend of the royal family, not least people like Prince Charles. He was brought into the royal family on his own admission by a guy called Lord Mountbatten, who was a known paedophile by anyone who's investigated the background. And even though it's come out since that the police and obviously the security services knew that Savile was a record-breaking paedophile at an extraordinary scale, they still allowed him to be a close friend, an inner circle buddy of the royal family, and a close friend of the sitting Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And this VIP abuse ring, in its historic setting, it's still going on now, relates to the government of Margaret Thatcher. So we are asked to accept, rightly, that there was this vast paedophilia ring. They don't mention, of course, that Savile was procuring children for the rich and famous. But there was this vast network of paedophilia. We're asked to believe that other entertainers were involved in it. And we're asked to accept that there was massive paedophilia in a stream of social services in local councils, in children's homes, etc. But that no elite politicians were involved, because only one has been collared, and he never even faced a trial, called Greville Janner, who Leicester police were desperate to, or some people in Leicester police in the Midlands were desperate to charge and prosecute for paedophilia, and he just died now. But he got away with it because in the end they said he had dementia and couldn't stand trial. And so you see this other story this week. There's another inquiry into paedophilia involving the elite, rich and famous, among other things, called the Goddard Inquiry. It's being overseen by some New Zealand judge. And this headline says, a Goddard Inquiry, children abused on a, quote, industrial scale. Physical and sexual abuse on an industrial scale remained unchecked for decades at children's homes in South London, a report by victims says. The report, detailing allegations by 600 people, will go before the independent inquiry into the child sexual abuse as a, with the first independent inquiry then. As a preliminary hearing, at a preliminary hearing earlier, the Shirley Oaks Survivors Association was given core participant status, and its leader, Raymond Stevenson, said child abuse in the Lambeth Council-run homes had been a reversal to the Dark Ages. The abuse had resulted in the shedding of thousands of tears, he said, and called it a shame on the establishment and institutionalized evil. Now, you look at the scale, and it's increasingly accepted that, yes, a massive scale of paedophilia. You look at the number of times famous people in politics are named by survivors of it. You look at the number of police officers who've gone public, who said that they were investigating it years ago, various things, including this thing in Lambeth, this situation in Lambeth. And when they got close to big names, they were shut down. And you put all that together, and yet the mainstream media is still now trying to get us to believe that because one person's claims have, according to the police, not been substantiated, and that investigation closed down, that somehow that ring, the ring never existed. It's extraordinary. And the great thing is, more and more people are not gullible as they would have been before in believing it. This must not be let go. This must, in the end, be exposed for what it is. A massive ring of paedophiles that have been able to continue to do what they do because they control the workings of state that protect them. Here's a story this week. It's from my own website. The almost laughable BBC climate change bias, a grotesque example. I was looking at a BBC program someone sent me. It's called The Big Questions, and it's fronted up by a guy called Nicky Campbell, who's interviewed me a few times years ago. Extraordinary arrogant man, I found him, and he certainly was on arrogant form fronting up this show, which was the most extraordinary expression of BBC bias. They have questions, and there's a little studio audience, and kind of invited people, most of them, if not all of them. And one of the questions that came up in this particular program was about climate change. And Nicky Campbell took the line straight away that the official story of climate change is true. Now, that's not the job of a host on a talk program and a discussion program. It's to be independent. It's to make sure everyone gets a fair say. But this is the BBC, so that didn't happen. So what happened is Liz Hutchins, a spokeswoman for Friends of the Earth, and a Green Party spokesman called Jonathan Bartley, who absolutely was challenging Nicky Campbell for the most arrogant person on the program. They were given freedom by this host to say what they liked, to give the party line, the official story of climate change. And then they went to a guy called Piers Corbyn. Piers Corbyn is an independent weather forecaster with a tremendous record of accuracy, greater than the official Met Office, who quite rightly says that this whole idea about human-caused climate change is a load of nonsense. And he explains in his interviews why that is in detail, using the science, which these people never do. They just repeat the official story, which claims to be science but isn't. And but when eventually, giving them a free ride, this Nicky Campbell chap turns to Piers Corbyn, the whole way of dealing with him changed compared with the other two. Now he was immediately in his introduction linked to Donald Trump as an effort to discredit him in the minds of the viewers, and it was taken as read by Campbell that he couldn't be telling the truth because he was challenging the official story, and then you had this classic situation where this Jonathan Bartley chap then tells Campbell that it was outrageous, basically, that he should have Piers Corbyn on his programme giving such ridiculous views. In other words, he should be silenced, shouldn't be given a platform so people can hear him. Now, the Green Party will say that they believe in freedom of speech. This is the same Green Party where its leader, Natalie Bennett, I mentioned this in the videocast last week, demanded that all government ministers and advisors who don't accept the climate religion's orthodoxy should be sacked. And these people who claim to be, about freedom and the people, these Greens are actually the new communism. They're the new Big Brother. But they're so full of their own purity, they can't see it. And when Bartley said that to Campbell, you shouldn't have him on the programme with these ridiculous views. Campbell didn't defend freedom of speech so much as defended the appearance of Corbyn on the basis that it allowed Bartley and the Friends of the Earth lady to, quote, slam dunk him. So what then happened is that the presenter of the Richie Allen show, Richie Allen, got in touch with Bartley and asked him if he would come on the next night, be given totally equal time, and treated with respect and equally to Piers Corbyn, and they could debate the whys and wherefores of climate change based on the science, which Corbyn would supply. Piers Corbyn had no problem, said he would come on. Bartley, the mouth of the Campbell programme, refused. And what he said was, there is no debate. The debate is already won, so there's no point. And what he was really saying is, I ain't coming on to debate with Piers Corbyn because I know I'll get slaughtered purely by the science. Richie then went to other members of the Green Party hierarchy, asked them, no. He went to Greenpeace, no. And he went to Friends of the Earth, no. They're all terrified because debating with someone who knows what he's talking about in relation to climate is their worst nightmare. Because most people repeat the official story of climate change because that's what they do. They repeat official stories. But there are some, and some won't even admit it to themselves, who do know it's a load of nonsense and it's unjustifiable. But it suits them for the myth to continue. It's time they went back to school. Oh no, it's time they got educated. See you next week. Bye.